and called me up and said, would it be possible for you and I to meet? Got some questions I'd like to ask. And of course I was more than happy for that to happen, and Nathan took time out of his schedule and came and we sat in my office for I don't know how long it was, but Nathan just asked questions about the Bible Institute. He had heard some things that were not accurate. And to me, it showed what kind of man this was. He was one that wanted to know the truth, was interested in what it is that the Bible Institute believes and taught. And I've never forgotten that, obviously. And I've never thought about what a high-quality man Nathan is. I love this man. I respect him immensely for who he is and what he's done and what he's meant to the various work in the Denver area. And so just really enjoy having Nathan this close and appreciate his love for the Word, his love for the Lord, his love for the church, and the good work that he's doing right in the Denver area. So looking forward to hearing him in this particular session.
Well, I am truly thankful. Well, let me turn that on. Let's see. Okay, let's start again. I am truly thankful to be able to reciprocate those feelings and say that I genuinely love and appreciate Brother Denny and the Bear Valley Church of Christ and the Bear Valley Bible Institute. My wife grew up a large part of her life at the Bear Valley congregation, and it holds a very dear place in her heart and in ours. And so we are truly thankful for this body, for all the work that she does, and we are truly blessed by our association with her. I'm thankful to be able to help in whatever way I can the work of the Bear Valley Bible Institute, and honored to be a part of this program. Now I want to say that I really appreciate you all. Y'all are here at 2:30 on a Saturday after you've probably gone out and had a great big lunch, right? Okay, so I love you for being here, and I promise that what we're going to do together will be worth your time. I'm going to do the best that I can to explain to you my favorite argument for the existence of God. It's called the moral argument, also known as the axiological argument. So the moral argument says, or rather, the moral argument is an attempt to prove that God exists by reasoning from some feature of morality or the moral life to the existence of God. So the moral argument says that there is an obvious moral realm, and that moral realm has to be explained by something. What is it? The moral argument says the best explanation for this moral realm of existence is God. Logically arranged, the moral argument looks like this. 1, if objective moral truths exist, then God must exist. 2, objective moral truths exist. And so 3, therefore, God must exist. Now, I will tell you that this argument is logically valid. Now, what that means is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion absolutely follows from the premises. It must be true. The question, of course, is, does this argument work? Would you be surprised to know that some say this argument doesn't work? Would you be surprised to know that some raise objections against the moral argument? Well, obviously they do, and along through our study, we're going to be looking at some alternative hypotheses to explain the existence of objective moral truths. But I'm going to say to you that the moral argument works. And the way that we want to demonstrate that is by examining the two premises of the moral argument. Now, we're actually going to start with the second or minor premise first. The second premise asks, or rather says, objective moral truths exist. We're going to ask the question, do objective moral truths exist? And hopefully, to keep your attention, these are some of the places that we're going to be going. All right, we'll be explaining how those pictures relate to this premise. Okay, so we need to define some terms. In order to see that objective moral truths exist, we need to know what we are talking about. So first, what do we mean when we say objective? When we say objective, we mean what President John Adams said. He said, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the states of facts and evidence. How many of you have heard Ben Shapiro say the facts don't care about your feelings? Okay, that's what it means to say that moral truths are objective. It means the facts don't care about your feelings, okay? So objective moral truths are mind-independent facts of reality. We might say it this way, regardless of what anybody thinks about it, objective moral truths exist, or some things really are right and are wrong. I don't know if Brother Brandon May is in our assembly this afternoon, astrophysicist. If he were, I might say to him, you know, Brother Brandon, I don't like coming in third at anything. My buddy Dean would say, second place is first loser. What does that make third place, right? I don't like coming in third at anything. Therefore, when someone says to me that the earth is the third planet from the sun, that really rubs me the wrong way. I can't stand that. So I'm going to tell you what. In my universe, the earth is the first planet from the sun. Now, what do you suppose Brother Brandon would say to that? Or any other sixth grader or third grader? They'd say, you know what, it doesn't matter how you feel. The earth is still the third planet from the sun, right? And so that's what we mean when we say that moral truths are objective. By contrast, the opposite of objective is subjective. Subjective means it's based on or influenced by your personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. So what we're arguing when we argue the moral argument is that moral truths are not subjective. They are not based on or influenced by our personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. All right, so what do we mean when we speak of moral truths? Well, here's a scene that has probably played out in every household that's represented here, right? Something's going on here. There's a quarrel. Some unfairness is happening one way or the other. Now, all of the girls are saying he wouldn't share, so finally she had to take the remote, right? And all of the boys are saying she stole the remote from me, right? But something's happening here with regard to good and bad, right and wrong, ought and ought not. When we speak of moral truths, those are the kinds of truths with which we are concerned. Now, I've been hoping to give this presentation so I can tell you about that little girl. What does the word truth mean? Did you know that we're going to have to go back and explain this to this generation? Did y'all know that? That before we can show people the truth of the Bible, now we just have to tell them what the truth is. And we have to make a case for that. And we have to contend for the classic view of the truth, which is known as the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth says that truth is that which corresponds to the facts of reality, or truth is telling it like it is. Now I want to tell you about that little girl. You know, grandparents say, let me tell you about my grandchildren. As an uncle, I'm going to say, let me tell you about my niece. All right? This is Stella Jane. That's a good southern name, isn't it? Family name. Stella Jane. Stella Jane is 5 years old in this picture. Can you tell that she likes sweets? All right, Stella Jane likes sweets. When Stella was not quite 4 years old, on a Saturday morning at 6 a.m., my sister heard rustling in the kitchen. She heard plastic wrappers. And then she heard feet padding quickly out of the kitchen and down the hall. And my sister said, this is not good. I don't know what it is. It's too early on a Saturday and somebody's getting into something, right? And so she sprang out of bed, out of the room, and saw a shadowy figure making their way down a dark hallway. My sister flipped on the light, and there was Stella Jane. She stood sheepishly against the wall and looked with guilt at her mother. Now her mother looked at her. She had seen chocolate wrappers on the counter in the kitchen. And she looked at Stella Jane, and did you know there was chocolate on her fingertips? And there was chocolate around her mouth. And so her mother said to her, Stella Jane, what have you been doing? And Stella said, not eating chocolate. Okay, so we know what the truth is, don't we? And 3-year-olds know what the truth is. The truth is telling it like it is. So when we speak of objective moral truths, we are saying that there are mind-independent facts of reality, and that we can describe those truths and tell it like it is. Some things really are right, and some things really are wrong. Now, the position that we're taking, philosophically speaking, is known as moral realism. This position says moral facts exist and are part of the fabric of the universe. They exist independently of our thoughts about them. Now, we get to take a test. I know y'all were excited about going to a lecture. Now we're going to take a test, okay? So I want to ask you, do objective moral truths actually exist in reality? And there's an easy way to answer that question. That is by seeing if we can answer this question. So I want you to think for a moment whether you can answer this question. I know it is always wrong for anyone, anywhere, at any time to fill in the blank. Okay, think for a moment. It's always wrong. Anyone, anywhere, any time for them. Can you think of something? All right. Steal, somebody said. Okay. Lie. All right. Well, I've taken one that no one could dispute. It's always wrong for anyone, anywhere, at any time to torture a child. That has to be right, doesn't it? Okay, well, if that's right, then we can say objective moral truths exist. Well, let's look at it the other way. I know it is always right for anyone, anywhere, at any time to. Okay, is there something that it's always right for a person could never be wrong? It's just always right for a person to do that. Can you think of something? Sir? Be a Bronco fan, this man said. Wearing blue and orange for you, brother. Okay, that's Bronco orange, not volunteer orange, Corey Sawyers. Okay. Pray to God. Okay. How about feed a starving child? Isn't that always right? Any person, anywhere, at any time. So what we can conclude from these simple examples is that there are objective moral truths that exist in reality. Now, as we said, there are some objections to this premise. We'll notice 3 basic kinds of objections. First, there is moral nihilism. Moral nihilism says there is no good or bad, really. Torturing a child and feeding the hungry are morally neutral acts. They are neither good or bad. Are you appalled by that idea? Well, you may be surprised to learn that many people hold that position, and they hold it stringently. All right, another objection to the existence of objective moral truths is moral skepticism. This says, we really just cannot know. Think about all of the moral confusion that exists in our world. We really just cannot know whether actions are right or wrong. All right, and a third objection is moral relativism, which says actions like these are determined to be right or wrong by the opinions or feelings of individuals or of groups. Now, if you think for a moment about the moral experience that you've had in your life, okay, the moral experience that you share with me, that you share with your spouse and with your loved ones, isn't it true that when we look at our shared moral experience, what we all observe is that some things really are right and some things really are wrong? In fact, the power of this argument is that most people will agree with that fact. Sit down with an atheist, and most likely he will agree with you that some things really are right and they really are wrong. Our shared moral experience it impresses it upon us. We know it deep down in the depths of our hearts, and we experience that every day. And so, Dr. William Lane Craig says, my claim is that we are justified in believing premise 2 on the ground of our moral experience unless and until we have a defeater of that experience. Just as we are justified in believing that there is a world of physical objects around us on the ground of our sense experience, unless and until we have a defeater of that experience. So as we make the moral argument, generally speaking, atheists will agree with us regarding premise 2. They will agree that objective moral truths exist. So atheist Louise Antony concedes, Any argument for moral skepticism will be based on premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values and duties themselves, that is, than premise 2 itself. So we start with premise 2 because usually everyone can see the truth of premise 2. The problem comes in when we try to make the major premise true, when we try to argue for premise 1. If objective moral truths exist, then God must exist. What happens when we make this argument is that we are asking this question: what explains the existence of objective moral truths? And while even atheists may be willing to say that objective moral truths exist, obviously they're not willing to say that God is the reason that objective moral truths exist. And so other alternatives are going to be offered to explain why objective moral truths exist. How many of you know this guy, or the guy this guy is representing? Sherlock Holmes? Okay, like Sherlock Holmes. Does Sherlock Holmes solve problems by deduction? How many of you have heard that? He does not solve problems by deduction. Okay, shake your head this way, no. Okay, Sherlock Holmes doesn't solve problems by deduction. Sherlock Holmes solves problems by abduction. Okay, what is abduction? Abduction is an inference to the best explanation form of justification. In other words, abduction says the hypothesis that best explains a set of facts is likely the correct one. Isn't that what Sherlock Holmes does? He says, okay, well, there's the shoe print in the mud, right? And there's the horsehair on the sleeve, and there was the blood on the mallet. Therefore, this person owns that shoe, and it was his sleeve, and it was his mallet, so he's the one that committed the murder, right? He looks at a set of facts, and he says, this is the explanation that best explains those facts. What are we doing in the first premise of the moral argument? What we're doing is we are looking at several different explanations of the fact that objective moral truths or objective moral values and duties exist. And we're asking which one is the best explanation of that fact. And what we do is, by a process of elimination, conclude that God is the only explanation for the existence of objective moral truth. So that's what's before us in the next 24 minutes and 17 seconds. Brother Denny isn't going to have to come up here and haul me off, okay? So the first thing we want to talk about is moral naturalism an explanation for the existence of objective moral truths? What is moral naturalism? Moral naturalism is the moral aspect of evolutionary naturalism, the prevailing theory of science for explaining the origin of human life. Moral naturalism argues that man evolved moral instincts as a survival adaptation. So think about it this way. You know, man evolved, right, and his behavior was a product of those survival pressures. And what man learned, or what happened, was that those men who shared food with each other survived, and those who didn't share food didn't survive. And so sharing became a moral value. All right, it was adopted as a moral truth. This is the theory, a very brief overview. Now I want to say to you this. You're going to see many who raise moral naturalism as an explanation for the existence of moral truths. But moral naturalism has many problems. It has more problems than we can possibly address here today. I include one other problem in the book that you might want to look at, but we're going to look at two major problems with moral naturalism as an explanation for the existence of objective moral truths. First, we'll look at the herd morality problem, and second, we will look at the value problem. First, let's look at the herd morality problem. The herd morality problem essentially says this, that the things that we call objective moral truths are really only survival adaptations. They are really only survival instincts. They are the product of survival pressures of natural selection through a process of evolution over millions of years. Okay, so Dr. William Lane Craig explains it this way. He says, on a naturalistic view, moral values are just the behavioral byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibits cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because of natural selection, Because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have evolved a sort of herd morality for precisely the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species, but on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively binding and valid. All right, so notice that on evolutionary naturalism, morals are actually only things that give us an advantage in surviving. Now, interestingly, Charles Darwin, in The Descent of Man, anticipated this problem for his theory. His theory cannot explain why we believe that objective moral truths exist. Here's what he wrote: if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a shadow of doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. All right, do you see what he says? This is the behavior that was produced amongst hive bees through survival adaptation, and though we have a certain set of morals, if the conditions under which man had evolved were different, then we would have a different set of morals. Now, what that demonstrates is that what we call moral truths are really on naturalism only survival behaviors. Michael Roos, a philosopher of science, says, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. What's he saying? Objective moral truths don't actually exist. Objective moral truths don't. We think they do. We think they do. We've been conditioned to think that through a process of evolution. They don't actually exist. Well, Dawkins comes out and states it plainly. Excuse me. He says there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Notice the admission of one of the greatest evolutionary scientists of our age, Richard Dawkins. He says, there is no real evil and no good. But didn't we say that we were sure that there is a real evil and a real good? And so on this basis, uh-oh, what have I done? Excuse me. On this basis, we can conclude that evolution naturalism is not an explanation of objective moral truth. Moral naturalism has another problem. That problem we can call the value problem. How many of you remember the story of Harambe the silverback gorilla and the 3-year-old toddler who fell into his cage at the Cincinnati Zoo? Do you remember that? What did Harambe do? Well, as soon as the toddler fell in, Harambe went and grabbed him, right? Excuse me. And the officials had to decide what to do about the situation. What did they decide to do? Do you remember? Old gorilla, I think he was 40 years old or so. They killed the gorilla. And what happened in society? There was an outcry. How could you kill a gorilla? In fact, some made the argument that the gorilla was of greater value than the human being, because silverback gorillas are more rare than toddler human beings are. And they do less harm to the environment. We know that's wrong, don't we? We just know that human beings are more valuable than animals, don't we? How can evolutionary naturalism explain that, though? Dr. Craig says, in particular, why think that human beings would have objective moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently. It's hard to see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good any more than insect well-being, or rat well-being, or hyena well-being. Now, on the evolutionary naturalistic view of man, man is just matter. He's just matter, just like rocks and dirt. He's just matter, just like insects and other animals. And he is not of any greater worth than is any other animal or any other thing. Peter Singer says that if we think that humans are of greater value than animals are, then we're guilty of speciesism, preferring one species. But did you know that on evolutionary naturalism, he's consistent with his theory? That is the conclusion that we should draw about human beings. He says the belief that human life and only human life is sacrosanct is a form of speciesism. Well, you look at that picture and tell me, which one's more valuable? The little child or the gorilla? We all know with certainty that human beings are more valuable than animals. And so, we can know with certainty that evolutionary naturalism does not explain adequately the objective moral truths that we observe in reality. Now, as Christians, and on theism, that is, on the belief that God exists, we have an explanation for the value of human life, don't we? Genesis 1:26 says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, and according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." With these considerations in mind, we are right to reject moral naturalism as an explanation of the existence of objective moral truths. Let's look at another explanation. Excuse me. You may be asking, what does Oprah Winfrey have to do with the moral argument? Well, here's what she has to do with it. And maybe y'all heard about her first presidential speech that she gave at the Golden Globes in 2018 as she began her presidential candidacy. In that speech, she said, "What I know for sure is that speaking your truth is the most powerful tool we all have." Have you heard someone say, "Well, you have your truth and I have my truth"? That's the world we live in today, right? And that reflects an influence of individual subjectivism. Individual subjectivism says that morality is determined by personal opinion. You have your truth, I have mine. You do what is right for you, and I will do what is right for me. Now, I'm sure you see a real problem with individual subjectivism right off the bat, right? According to individual subjectivism, moral truths are not objective. They're not mind-independent facts of reality. Instead, they're subjective. But we've already said that we know that moral truths are objective, regardless of what anybody thinks about it. Some things are really right, and some things are really wrong. And so those who would suggest that individual subjectivism explains the moral facts of reality simply are not agreeing with what we experience in our shared moral experience in life. Now, there are a lot of other problems with individual subjectivism. I don't have the time now to cover those, but we can certainly exclude individual subjectivism as an explanation for objective moral truths in reality. Another thesis that's put forward is called cultural relativism. Cultural relativism says that culture or society determines for itself what is right and what is wrong. Can you see some problems with this view? What's wrong with cultural relativism? Well, according to this view, Nazi culture was right. Those Germans who opposed Nazism were actually wrong because they were opposing the moral laws. On this view, moral progress is impossible because the culture is never wrong. According to this view, reformers like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a man who left America and went back to his homeland of Germany to fight Nazism during World War II, and who was executed, who was hanged 2 weeks before the war was over. He went back trying to help his people, trying to change his culture. On cultural relativism, he would be wrong for opposing the perceived injustices in his society. Again, as with individual subjectivism, so with cultural relativism, these explanations make moral truths subjective rather than objective. That doesn't agree with our shared experience of moral reality. And so we can exclude cultural relativism as an explanation for objective moral truths. What about man-made or positive law? You may know someone who holds this view. Listen, if the law says I can do it, then it's right. Okay, if the law permits it, or if it requires it, then it's right. If it excludes it or prohibits it, then it's wrong. The law of the land determines right and wrong. Well, don't we all know that there have been laws of the land that were absolutely wrong? What about the Jim Crow laws in the United States of America that segregated by race public spaces, public schools, public transportation? We know that those laws were wrong, don't we? But they were the laws of the land. How is it that though they were the law of the land, they were wrong? Well, the answer is that there must be a law that is above the law of the land, by which we can judge the law of the land. As we call the law of the land a positive law, we would refer to this law above the law as a suprapositive law. Augustine said an unjust law is no law at all. Thomas Jefferson said, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. Martin Luther King said, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. We know what's wrong with the view that man-made law determines what's right and wrong, don't we? Law led to the Holocaust, didn't it? In the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis defended themselves by saying, befell ist befell. What that means is, I was just following orders. Okay, I just did what I was commanded to do. And the judges in that court said, there is a law above the law, and by it you are judged and you are condemned. Positive law does not explain the existence of objective moral truth. For time, we're going to skip utilitarianism. We discussed that in the book. Let's look at one final possible explanation for the existence of objective moral truths. This explanation may be called the brute fact explanation, or we might call it the I don't know explanation. Okay? What if mom comes home from work one day and she sees that a window on the front of the house has been broken, right? And she wonders, what has happened here? There's no glass on the outside. She walks in the house, there's glass on the inside, right? And she sees in the middle of all of that glass a baseball that she recognizes. It belongs to Johnny, her son. And she goes to Johnny, her son, and she says, look, I've got some facts here I need an explanation for. I've got a broken window, I've got glass on the inside, I've got your baseball here, and I think you were playing out here in the yard, and you threw this ball. And he says, I don't know. How did that happen? He said, I don't know how that happened. And she says, are you meaning to say to me, it just happened? You have no idea, it just happened. How many of you moms buy that one? Dads, anybody buying that one? Are we going to take the baseball away for a little while? Save some allowance to help pay for it? Because we don't buy it just happened, right? The brute fact argument is the it just happened argument. It's the I don't know, it just happened. Okay? A brute fact is a fact that is obtained or explained by itself rather than through other facts, that has a fundamental or underlying role in explaining other facts. A brute fact is just a fact that we see but cannot explain in terms of other things. It is a fact that has no explanation. So, when pushed away from all of these other explanations, one who wants to resist the conclusion that God must be the explanation for the existence of objective moral truths will say, well, they must just exist. I don't know how to explain it, they're just there. It's like when Bertrand Russell said of the universe, I don't know, it's just there. Okay, well, there are some problems with the it's just there explanation. Number one, how is it there? What are these? Are these just floating facts out here? Are they material things? Have they been produced by material cause? If they haven't been produced by material cause, are they spiritual things that are floating out here that are determining right and wrong? That sounds a lot like God, doesn't it? Are you now meaning to posit that these spiritual things exist out here in our universe? Another problem. Objective moral truths are statements of facts. It is right to feed a starving child. It is wrong to torture a child. Well, who made those statements? There has to be someone who made those statements. Objective moral truths are evaluations of right and wrong. They say some things are really right and some things are really wrong. Who was the personal evaluator on the brute fact explanation who made those evaluations and who set those laws in place within our universe. That's the fourth objection. Who binds these? You know, we feel a burden under these laws, don't we? We violate the laws of morality. When we do wrong against a brother or sister or against a friend, we feel guilty, don't we? We feel a duty to that person to apologize, and we feel a duty to that law to do what is right and to stop doing what. Who puts the authority in the moral facts of reality? There has to be some authority behind them. The brute fact explanation cannot deal with the authority behind the moral facts of reality. And so we can exclude the brute fact view as an explanation for the existence of objective moral truths. That leaves one answer. If you can think of another, I'd love to hear it, by the way. Really. There's just one answer left, and that answer is God. God is the explanation for the existence of objective moral truths. When we speak of God, of whom are we speaking? We are speaking of that God whom Brother Aaron Johnson described in his lecture this morning. You remember the maximally great being whom he described? He has omnipotence, and he has omniscience, and what else does he have? Moral perfection. And so when the moral argument speaks of God, it's speaking of that maximally great being who has moral perfection. Now, we, of course, are thinking of the God of the Bible, aren't we? Psalm 100, verse 5, one of my favorite verses. One of my favorite passages in the Bible says, the Lord is what? The Lord is good. The Lord is good. How good is he? How good is God? Are y'all still awake out there? We're almost done. 5 minutes. How good is God? How good is he? He's awesome. He's perfectly good, isn't he? God is perfectly good. He is the locus and paradigm of goodness. That is, if we want to know what goodness is, it's defined by God's perfectly good nature. If we want to understand what goodness is, God is the source of that goodness. What did James say about every good and perfect gift? Comes from above, right? Comes from God. If there's anything good that we know in this world, who did it come from? Came from God. God is perfectly good. That's the God we're talking about. Now you think about if there is a perfectly good God, what that means in terms of explaining the existence of objective moral truths. Here are some conclusions. If a perfectly good God exists, then we have an ultimate standard in our reality by which to judge all moral statements or actions. God's perfect nature. Is something right or wrong? How do I know? What is the nature and character of God? What is the will of God? What does the Word of God say on that subject? Am I being God-like or godly when I do that? If a perfectly good God exists, then we can make these kinds of judgments about right and wrong. If a perfectly good God exists, then we have answers to moral concerns, like the moral concern of knowledge. Can I know what is right and wrong? Yes, I can, because I can know God. I can know his character. I can know his nature. I can read about him through his revelation. And so I can have knowledge of right and wrong. And we can agree on right and wrong, because we can look at the nature of God, and then we can look at an action and say, does that compare to the nature of God, or does it contrast with the nature of God? We can be absolute about right and wrong, can't we? We look at the nature of God and we say God is perfectly good. God would never hurt. God would never steal. God wouldn't lie, for example. Therefore, if God wouldn't lie, then it's absolutely always wrong for a person to lie. We can look at the character of God and say, is our culture getting closer to the character of God? If so, we're making moral progress. Is our culture getting farther away from the character of God? If so, we are digressing as a culture. We can take actions for justice. If a perfectly good God exists, we can say, this is absolutely right, that's absolutely wrong. You did that, therefore we have the right to punish you for it. If a perfectly good God exists, then we know what it is that gives humans their special value. It is the fact that we are created in the image of God. We are spiritual beings. If a perfectly good God exists, then we have a lawgiver who wrote the law by which we all feel bound. Otherwise, we should ask the question, why is it that we believe that we should keep the moral laws of reality? If a perfectly good God exists, then we have a judge who will judge us according to his moral law, rewarding good, punishing evil, and offering ultimate justice. What's going to happen to those war criminals of the past century who were never brought to justice? Did they just get away with it? Is that it? If a perfectly good God exists, then there's a great day coming, isn't there? And on that day, he's appointed a judge who will judge the world in righteousness. And those who have done evil in this life will be punished. Those who have done good will be rewarded with life eternal. If God doesn't exist, then we simply cannot explain these moral facts in our reality. In other words, if a perfectly good God exists, then we have an explanation for the many moral facts of life. How can we explain the existence of objective moral truths? Either God explains them, or there absolutely is no explanation for them. So what have we seen together today? We have seen first that objective moral truths exist. And second, we have seen that if objective moral truths exist, then God must exist. And so what can we conclude after studying the moral argument? We can conclude with confidence, therefore, God must exist. I thank you so much for your very kind and gracious attention.